Peaceable assembly is the cornerstone to the ongoing fight for equal rights. And in America, we look towards the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s as our primary model.
It all started when Mrs. Rosa Parks wouldn't give up her seat on the bus to a white man.
This is rehearsal. Men getting to know their machines.
But at the dawn of World War II, over 20 years before the famous March on Washington, 100,000 black activists came within 10 days of marching on the Capitol, forcing a crucial early inflection point in the fight for civil rights.
The March on Washington of 1941 was a precursor to the more famous march in 1963. And although the one in 1941 did not actually happen, it was successful in achieving its objective.
So how do you quickly mobilize 100,000 Americans in a time long before social media or even television? This is the story of the march that almost happened and the man behind it. Though the Civil Rights Act of 1875 technically guaranteed equal rights, lax enforcement, various Supreme Court rulings, intimidation, segregation, and violence systematically ensured that people of color remained left out of the American dream. It would take almost another century to put an end to segregation and begin the long process of equal rights. But icons who led the civil rights movement, like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, didn't exist in a vacuum. There are a lot of players who didn't wind up becoming household names.
Although the civil rights movement that we're most familiar with begins in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, it had roots in a much earlier period. In many ways, the strategies and the tactics and some of the people involved were the same.
Enter A. Philip Randolph.
They want complete equality, social, economic, and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution.
Although Randolph is probably less well known to most people today, he was, in the time, one of the most prominent and respected leaders in the black movement.
Roy Wilkins with A. Philip Randolph. They have fought their fight all of their adult lives.
Born in 1889, Randolph was raised in Florida, migrating up to New York City as a young adult to study economics and philosophy.
He was drawn to socialism and to the Socialist Party. He started a newspaper called The Messenger. It was a very much working class-oriented publication.
The Messenger advocated for black unions, resisted the draft in World War I, and pushed for integration inequality across the board. As a major promoter of black artists, The Messenger is also credited for helping launch an explosion of music, art, and literature that began in the 1920s, known today as the Harlem Renaissance. Randolph's high profile from The Messenger, plus his reputation as a union organizer, caught the attention of 500 overworked, underpaid railroad workers. In 1925, a secret meeting in Harlem established the first all-black union, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters.
The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters is a union of railway porters, but its roots go back to the end of the Civil War. A man named George Pullman organized a company to provide sleeper cars for railway travel. It's sort of similar to first-class travel today on airlines, except in this case, of course, he drew on a black labor force exclusively who would serve people food, clean up after them, make their bed. They weren't even accorded the dignity of having their own names. They were all called George.
Despite the demeaning nature of the work, this job offered one of the only upwardly mobile opportunities for black Americans who migrated to the North, hoping to escape the Jim Crow South.
It was an occupation of some respectability. I mean, it was, after all, in this period when most black laborers were on plantations and farms, and so they were looked up to.
While white travelers let these porters shine their shoes, make their beds, and serve them food, the Brotherhood quietly and methodically organized. Using the motto, "Fight or be slaves," Randolph led an expansion of the union to over 18,000 members nationwide. And ironically, a key to the Brotherhood's success was the very system that relegated them to their servile caste: the railroad.
The very nature of the work enabled them to develop strong connections among themselves, a pride, and a militancy that won them considerable approval in the black community as a whole. Porter gets on a train in New York, and he travels to Atlanta and maybe down to Florida or Louisiana up to Chicago or to California. And in the process, they're making connections among communities that otherwise might be isolated. Black newspapers, like the Chicago Defender, would use porters to distribute their papers. They become the instruments of communication nationwide. People would get information about what was going on in Chicago, in Mississippi, and vice versa. And the porters were instrumental in creating that sense of community and of connection.
This was their social network, the powerful potential of which Randolph cultivated to push for better working conditions and higher pay. But up to this point, Randolph had not yet been able to leverage this power beyond union organizing and collective bargaining. But that would all change after Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
As FDR's war mobilization began to lift the nation out of the Great Depression, African Americans were left out of the boom.
Black Americans were excluded, by and large, from fairly lucrative jobs in many cases in these defense industries. And Randolph, as a union leader, raised a protest to the government that if they did not deal with this problem, that is the racial discrimination against black workers, that he would bring a march on Washington.
And as it turns out, Randolph had a supporter in the White House, the First Lady, who took a greater interest in civil rights issues than her husband. In his 1941 correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt, Randolph put the White House on notice of his plans to organize a march on Washington to advocate for the right to work. But President Roosevelt's priority was to mobilize the war effort as quickly and smoothly as possible. He rejected Randolph's demands outright. Undeterred, Randolph continued to plan the march, and word spread through the Brotherhood's massive network. With less than 2 weeks before the march, the First Lady helped arrange a meeting between Randolph and President Roosevelt in the Oval Office.
It was not just him, it was also Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP, and Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a major leader among black women's organizations. And Roosevelt seemed to want to avoid actually addressing the demands that Randolph had made. Randolph at some point interrupts him and says, if we don't get some satisfaction on our demands, we will bring 100,000 black protesters to Washington, D.C. And Roosevelt's head snapped back, and he was incredulous. He turned to Walter White and asked him, well, can he do that? Which White answers, yep, he could do that. And the reason he could do it was because of the sleeping car porters.
President Roosevelt grudgingly signed an Executive Order 8802, ensuring fair hiring practices to black Americans and establishing the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was empowered to investigate and overturn race discrimination in industries engaged in military production. This was a major early victory for the civil rights movement, made possible by A. Philip Randolph's ability to quickly mobilize black Americans in a time when the closest thing we had to mass communication was FDR's fireside chats.
Nobody knows when total victory would come.
But Randolph did have to make some concessions, whose original demands included the desegregation of the armed forces. For Roosevelt, that was a bridge too far, who feared alienating military brass just before the war and going head-to-head with Southern Democrats in Congress. Randolph continued his fight after the war, organizing protests outside of the Democratic National Convention in 1948. And shortly after Truman won the election, he signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces.
We look at the March on Washington in 41, that didn't happen. The movement continued. That you don't win it in a single battle. It is a long, drawn-out struggle.
2 decades later, A. Philip Randolph would finally get his March on Washington, playing the lead role in organizing the largest civil rights demonstration in American history.
Today, the city of Washington takes notice. Our leaders, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, Reverend King, received the keys to the city.
Then the following year, this happened.
I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
It's fair to say that without the march, that would have been unlikely that there would have been very much progress passing that legislation.
A. Philip Randolph's fingerprint on the civil rights movement remains indelible. His persistence, strategies, and tactics are timeless and are studied by anyone hoping to organize for change today.